Hey guys, and welcome back to the FFP. My name is Christian, and today we'll be bringing you our Week 12 waiver wire considerations. It's funny, at Week 12, you'd think that we're really just narrowing it down to the playoff teams and the teams with good rosters, and who needs to make waiver wire claims at this point? That's absolutely not the case. I'm in a league where I currently hold the best record. I'm 8-2. Looks like I'm at least very likely to get a bye week in the playoffs. Things are going very well. I'm either first or second in fantasy points in that league, depending on how this week ends up finishing out. So I'm a very good team. I'm still shifting through the waiver wire every single week, desperately trying to find talent. No matter how good you are, you can always get better. Now, I also want to say that you guys should definitely take a look and be ready. We're going to be putting out a video this week on trade targets for Dynasty League players for Keeper League players, Dynasty League players for 2020. Guys, you should be targeting to keep for next year. That's another thing that I do. People always wonder, and I get this, me and my dad do a lot, how do you have such good keepers? That's because we're also projecting into next year. We're in a league where you can even trade draft picks, talent, defensive players, offensive players, a lot of things, and we're just constantly making moves to try to win both this year and set ourselves up for next year. This last year I had 3 first-round draft picks. This coming year I'll have 2 first-round draft picks, and so working that trade, that waiver wire, getting all that talent that you can, that's going to be very important. As always, there will be timestamps down in the description below, and if you have a comment or a question, leave it down below in the comment section, and I will do my best to answer you. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. Let's get right into it.
A back to consider picking up there if you're in a pinch. If you're like me, I got James Conner, a bunch of other backs that are banged up at this point, and I'm looking for some guys the next week or two as we head close to the stretch or the finish of the season here. Guy to consider is Jonathan Williams, running back for the Indianapolis Colts. He's 99% available out there. Now today, Marlon Mack fractured his hand. He's already been declared out for Week 12 and is most likely going to miss multiple games. That'll probably stretch into the playoffs for us fantasy owners out there. Now today in relief, Williams went out. He had 13 carries, 116 yards. He also had a reception for 31 yards. Looked pretty good in a relief effort there. Now he came in the league in 2016 for the Buffalo Bills. In the preseason there, he looked like he had some talent. He made some noise in the preseason, looked decent anyways. Saw a little bit of action in the regular season, nothing too significant. That was it for him. His next action he saw was 2018 with the New Orleans Saints. Didn't do a whole lot there. Now I look at this guy. He's not a great long-term option. If you need somebody you need to stream the next week or two, I think he's a solid play for you. Now this week they play the Texans, allowing the 14th fewest points to running backs. He's going to get the early down carries, and the guy that I think is going to be on third down or passing situations, another guy that's going to see increased value with Marlon Mack out, is going to be Nyheim Hines. And once again, he'll see an increase in carries, not significant. Maybe he'll get 6 to 8 carries per game, but he'll see a lot of action in the passing game there among those backs. Now, Hines, I would say, has value as a flex play in PPR leagues if you're in 12 teams or larger. Now, this is a guy that just came off a rookie season where he had 63 catches. That's really significant there. So once again, these two backs are going to have huge value now that Mack is going to miss at least a couple weeks there. So take a look at Jonathan Williams or Nyheim Hines, depending upon your scoring system and your need in fantasy.
All right, so the first guy I want to talk about is Josh Gordon. I like Josh Gordon a lot. For a guy who's 38% available, which he is, he's got a lot of upside. For starters, next week he plays the Philadelphia Eagles, giving up the 8th most fantasy points to wide receivers. That backfield there, their defensive back situation is just not great. They give up a lot of points. Everybody knows that. But when you look at it, his first game playing for the Seattle Seahawks was a pretty darn successful game when you really take a look at it. Not only was it against the 49ers, who is a good defense, and that already lowers my expectations for him. His 2 catches on 2 targets for 27 yards, at least to me, really impressed me. Now, he was on the field for 38% of the team's offensive snaps. That's not a whole lot, but for a guy who hadn't completely worked into the roster, didn't know the whole playbook, and probably didn't even have a complete route tree, that's all pretty impressive. Now, just 2 catches isn't great, but for 27 yards, that's not a bad yards per catch, and he caught both of his targets. He's a guy who's going to continue to grow in his chemistry with Russell Wilson, and that's where I talk about the upside, massive upside for this guy. Russell Wilson, as his quarterback, currently leads the NFL with a pass rating of 114.9. You can pretty much consider that 115. We'll round up the extra 1/10 of a percent or whatever, but he's also got 23 touchdown passes on the year. That's currently first in the NFL. He's played great. Now, the bad news is Tyler Lockett will be coming out. He was hospitalized last week and didn't play, so that definitely hurts him heading into the weeks in the future. But he's going to grow in his chemistry. He's got an MVP of a quarterback, or at least a guy who's in the MVP race, and he looked good. Again, the efficiency there was great. He caught both of his passes. Huge upside. There's definitely some downside with him. There's two other good wide receivers there. But all in all, I like this situation. It's a pickup that I would definitely consider making if you're looking for a wide receiver.
Jaylen Samuels is another guy to consider out there. This one's tough for me because I own James Conner in 3 leagues. He's 34% available out there. Next week, play Cincinnati, allowing the 3rd most points to running backs. Now, in our start sit video last week, we even asked the question. We said last week in the start sit video, which was playing James Conner in Thursday's game too soon to play him after he wasn't ready to play just 4 days prior? Was it wise? Would it be better to sit him one more game and now give him 10 more additional days to rest? Well, sure enough, James Conner goes out there, re-injures his shoulder. So a few questions there. One, will James Conner be back for week 12? Even if he is back, with his history of injuries, his inability to stay healthy, I love James Conner. He's a great back. He's very productive when he's on the field, but he's always banged up. The guy's always fighting some sort of injury there. So with his history of injuries, I think you need to take a look at picking up Jaylen Samuels. Now, we mentioned this previously in our videos. We've talked about it many times, and this is probably the reason why the Pittsburgh Steelers were in a hurry to get James Conner back on the field and run the ball back in action there, is that Samuels is just not nearly as good of a pure runner as James is there. In fact, he's really struggled in that role running the ball. He's got a 2.6 yards per carry, which is very low. His yards after contact, elusive rating, all those metrics are very low for Samuels as far as just being a running back go. And this is kind of the reason why Trey Edwards, the little U's, undrafted free agent journeyman, was given carries and a chance to get some first and second down carries when Samuels has been starting in place of Conner. But in spite of his struggles, in spite of the fact that Samuels does not run the ball really well, he's still a very solid play, especially in PPR leagues. And here's why. Jaylen in the last 5 games has had a total of 32 catches. He's also had a total of 171 receiving yards during those games, and he's receiving the ball 6.4 catches per game during that stretch. That's a crazy pace. In fact, if you project that out, that would turn out to be 102 catches over 16 games. Once again, he's very active in the passing game. And I think another reason why you can trust that usage in the passing game and why he's very secure in PPR league scoring is the play of Mason Rudolph. He's checking the ball down quite often to him and James Conner. If you look at Mason's average distance of throw, it's much shorter than Ben Roethlisberger when he's quarterbacking or when Ben's at the helm there. So he's a guy I think you definitely need to pick up, especially if you own James Conner out there. He's available in 34% of the leagues. Now, obviously, whether you're going to start him is based on James Conner's health and availability. We'll have to monitor it this week. But right now, Sam is the guy that you need to grab, you need to put on your bench.
At 86% available, Hunter Renfrow is a guy you should consider picking up, not only for this week, we just mentioned he's another Raider, going against the Jets, 2nd most fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. That's great, but for me, even more than that is Dynasty League potential. This guy looks like Wes Welker, except better. It's funny, I made that comparison in my mind. I felt like, wow, he really looks like Wes Welker, and then you really watch him play, you look at the stats and realize he's probably going to be better than Wes Welker. Heading into this year, a couple of years ago, one of the guys I like wide receivers that was young was Cooper Kupp. He's my new Cooper Kupp. I'm getting excited about him. I think he's going to be one of the top receivers in the NFL just a year or two from now. Take a look at this. He has 16 receptions on 19 targets. That is 84.2% reception percentage. That's since week 7, by the way. That's 2nd best in the NFL among the 67 qualifying NFL receivers. The league average is 62%, so he is 22% ahead of that. He has a super high catch percentage. He's also averaging 14 fantasy points a game over the last 4 games. Now that is PPR scoring. He holds less value in standard leagues. He's not been a big touchdown guy, but both of his touchdowns this year, he's only got 2 on the year, but both of them have come in the last 4 games. And to be quite honest, it almost looks like he's starting to take over Tyrell Williams' #1 role. Now, I just talked about Tyrell Williams being a pickup consideration, and here's why I can really say this for both of them. I don't think that Hunter Renfrow has yet done that. That's a prediction I'm maybe making more for next year. Right now, they both still hold value. Hunter Renfrow more as the PPR guy, Tyrell Williams more as the red zone touchdown guy, but the upside of him is phenomenal. If you're looking for a dynasty pickup wide receiver to keep that could just be a monster next year, he is absolutely the one to look at. He reminds me sort of like I said, Wes Welker, but better. Maybe a DJ Chark, a guy who isn't coming in breaking out as a rookie or switching teams, but just simply getting better one year to the next, could break out next season. You've seen throughout this year, he's simply getting better every week and developing as a wide receiver. And that's really more than you can ask for in the NFL. I'm just so excited about him. Leave a comment down below if you're as excited as I am. I'm hopping on the Hunter Renfrow train. Let me know if you are too.
Jacob Hollister, the Seattle Seahawks tight end is 73% available out there. Playing Philadelphia, allowing the 10th fewest points to tight ends. Now, before I talk about him, I want to talk about Will Disley a little bit, tight end that was there for a while, who had season-ending injury. Now, if you look at Disley's role, before he got injured, he became what I would call a mainstay and a trusted go-to guy for Russell Wilson, who, by the way, is having an MVP type of season there. Will had 4 touchdowns in 4 weeks and 22 catches just prior to season-ending injury. Now, Jacobs' role seems to be evolving into a very similar role that Will had prior to that injury. Now, if you look at Hollister, he spent 2 seasons with New England. Now, albeit he was behind some good weapons, behind Gronk and some other players there. But he was really just a journeyman. So the question for me now is, now he's playing for Seattle. He was just a journeyman before. Does he have a significant role? Does he have enough of a role where we as fantasy owners can really trust or use this guy? Be careful before you cast off a player like a journeyman like him or figure that he doesn't have any value. And I want to give you an example. Think about another tight end this year that's having a great season. That's Darren Waller. He was on the Ravens team before, and his best year that he ever had ended with a total of 85 receiving yards. Not very good. Now with Oakland, he's having an all-pro type of season. Sometimes a change of scenery is all player needs to really become a productive player in this league. Now, he didn't get his chance to be productive, or at least get on the field, get some usage there until Disley went down. And his first stats did not appear until week 7. But since week 7, last 3 weeks, his targets have went from 2 to 6 to 10. His catches from 2 to 4 to 8. And his yardages have went from 8 to 37 to 62. In the last 3 weeks, he's added 3 touchdowns. This guy carries a little bit of a risk there. Obviously, he's not a proven tight end. But the tight end position is so thin at this point, I think you need to grab this guy and at least put him on your bench. Now, I wish I could give you a guy out there that has less risk, but Travis Kelce type of players are not out there this type of year. Any guy that you're going to pick up to play in a lot of those positions is going to carry a little bit of a risk. So you're about weighing the risk and look at, but here's a guy that I think has got upside, especially in that offense where Russell Wilson loves to look towards his tight ends, especially in the red zone. So take a look at him as a guy that maybe you need to pick up. Jacob Hollister, tight end for the Seattle Seahawks.
All right, so now we got Bo Scarbrough. Now he's 99% available, and that's not going to be that way after this coming week. When we look at the waiver claims, he is going to get picked up a ton. He played great in the last game. Now he plays the Washington Redskins coming up, giving the 7th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. This is an important matchup, is more and more important in the waiver wire as we get deeper into the season because there's simply less games to worry about, and we're coming to a point where every single win counts. And so a lot of pickups are just for a 1-week guy, and yet that's fine. Now, his 14 carries for 55 yards and a touchdown on 3.9 yards per carry was good. He didn't have any targets or receptions. When you look at the guy, he's not really seemingly built to be a big receiving back. That could definitely improve in the future. A lot of running backs, a guy like Melvin Gordon came in the league, wasn't known for that and has definitely improved throughout that ability overall. But what I like most about it is that his 31 snaps easily outweighed Ty Johnson's 18 and J.D. McKissick's 14. Now, he did command 14 of the backfield's 19 rushing attempts as well. So it's not just time on the field when they're bringing him on to do pass blocking or whatever. He was getting the majority of the carries, and he looked pretty good. He didn't look phenomenal. He didn't look amazing. This isn't the guy that I'm going to pick up and keep in dynasty leagues. But if you're really desperate at running back, this could be a guy to pick up and play. Definitely a guy to add some depth to your running back position. And hey, why not just keep him off of other people's rosters?
Kareem Hunt, 23% available versus Miami, allowing the 6th most points to running backs there. Now, in the 2 weeks since returning from suspension, this guy's had 10 carries, nothing to write home about, nothing to get too excited about there, but his usage in the passing game has been eye-catching, and this is why I think you need to take a look at this guy as an option for you down the stretch. He's shown very little rust. He's looked great. Come back, he had 1 game where he caught 6 balls for 46 yards, another game where he caught 7 balls for 44 yards on 18 targets in those 2 weeks. He's been very active in the passing game there. Now, he's not going to unseat Chubb as the team's lead back. Nick is one of the best pure runners in the NFL right now. I look at the best pure running backs in the NFL, I'd have to say, look at all the metrics that break down some of those things as far as just being the best pure running back. I would say Nick Chubb and Ezekiel Elliott are probably 1-2 right there, arguably 2 backs in my opinion, just as far as being pure runners go. So he's not going to unseat him. With that said, I think it's easy to forget that Hunt, a few years ago, back in 2017, was 4th in running back scoring in fantasy. He was excellent. He's young. He's very talented. In his first 2 seasons, he had 25 touchdowns on 27 games. And so here's what it's like for the Cleveland Browns. You got to love what you're set up with right now. It's like having a true 3-down back, guy that can play in any situation, can run the ball, can run between the tackles, can get out in space, has got great hands. You have a true 3-down back as your 3rd down back. And so you got to love that, or your change of pace back. So you've got 2 excellent guys there. In fact, as he continues to be successful, you're going to see a lot more times when both backs are on the field at the same time, especially with David Njoku out. I see those shorter throws going to the running backs, especially somebody like Kareem Hunt. I would say his value is probably more as a flex play, though. You're not going to start him as a running back 1 or 2 unless you're in a very, very large league or you're in a pinch. But he's got definitely flex value in PPR league scoring.
All right, so now I think we got to talk about Kyle Rudolph at 45% available. He is not a bad waiver wire tight end to look at. Now, this is not a guy with massive upside, but he's a guy who has safe floor. Now, when we look back throughout his career, he hasn't been phenomenal. Really, since 2017, he has been fantasy irrelevant, so to speak. But if you go back to 2016 with Sam Bradford, he looked great. He had a very good year that year. Now, Kirk Cousins is no Sam Bradford, but he's had quite the resurgence, and he played very well, especially in the second half of the Broncos game, throwing 3 touchdowns. So there's definitely a lot to like there. Now, one of the things that you have to understand when you look at the numbers, because in the last 5 weeks, he's got 5 touchdowns coming off of the first 6 weeks being quite bad. But those touchdowns are great. You do have to really counter in the fact that Adam Thielen's not been playing the last few games. His injury has added a lot to be desired in the passing game, and that it could probably equate for at least a little bit of the added performance and the extra touchdowns that Kyle Rudolph has been getting. That being said, at the tight end position, it is so thin. As long as Adam Thielen is out, Kyle Rudolph holds some value. Again, we talk about with Adam Thielen, Stephon Diggs, Irv Smith, the running game, the defense, heck, Dalvin Cook out of the backfield. There's not a whole lot of upside there. But if you're looking for a standard league plug-and-play, especially in games where Adam Thielen is out, Kyle Rudolph is a guy to look towards. And again, he's 45% available. So I always like talking about guys who are at least a little bit more available. So essentially half of you are going to be able to look at him. Not the greatest option, but at this point in the season, if you're looking at picking up a tight end, it's hard to imagine there's much better of an option out there.
Devante Parker, 42% available. I can't believe he's basically 50% available out there in a lot of the leagues. Now, next week he plays the Browns, who allow the 12th fewest points to wide receivers. Now, I've mentioned this before, but he's a first-round pick. And the reason I like to mention that, it just reminds us this guy has skills. He's got the pedigree. He's not like a 7th-round pick and afterthought who's just there simply as a volume play who doesn't have a lot of talent. He does got skill. Now, right now he's on pace for 966 receiving yards, and that pace has actually gone up recently with Preston Williams out. Today he had 7 catches, 135 yards, had a huge game. He's the clear-cut, hands-down best wide receiver and weapon they have right now on that team. And Miami will often be playing from behind late in games, so they're going to force-feed him targets, especially now that Preston Williams is out. Now, he's had 20 targets the last 2 weeks. 3 times in the last 5 games he had double-digit targets. In his schedule, here's why you got to love him, okay? Here's his schedule. If you look at weeks 13, 14, 15, and 16, his schedule is excellent. Versus Philadelphia, Jets, Giants, and Cincinnati, all those teams are in the bottom third in terms of points allowed to wide receivers. He's got a great schedule coming up. You got to grab this guy, and he's going to help win some games for you.
At 27% available, you got to take a look at Jamison Crowder. For starters, 27% available is not a highly available, but he's had quite a bit of production, especially in PPR leagues, and in recent, finding the end zone quite a bit. Before we get to any of that, though, one of the big reasons is if you're one of those teams fighting for a playoff spot in a PPR league, this guy is an absolute stud. He had less value in standard leagues, but again, we'll get to the touchdowns in this week versus Oakland, giving up the 6th most fantasy points to wide receivers. He is absolutely one of those pickups that can help boost you into a win, help get you that extra win you need to get into the playoffs, get a bye, whatever it may be. Now, he's had an interesting season so far because he comes out week 1, 14 catches, 99 yards, 17 targets. That's 24.3 fantasy points without even finding the end zone. Then, of course, we have Sam Darnold going down for a few weeks, and that really hurt him. Then we come back to a few weeks later versus Dallas, is 6 catches for 98 yards. That's a solid week. Still hasn't found the end zone, though, and it's starting to be a concern. Then he plays New England and Jacksonville. That's 2 good defenses, and he disappoints again. And it's definitely starting to look like, okay, even though Sam Darnold's back, he doesn't have a whole lot of value. But you really just have to evaluate the fact that that's just some tough matchups right there. So we look at the last 3 weeks. Miami, the Giants, and the Washington Redskins, those 3 games. He had 8 catches, 5 catches, and 5 catches, 83 yards, 81 yards, and 71 yards. And in all 3 games, he scored a touchdown. He has really worked himself into clear-cut the #1 target for Sam Darnold. He scored 23, 19, and 18 fantasy points, and he's a guy that you should definitely start considering starting almost every week. In a bad matchup against a good pass defense, don't get me wrong, he is a sittable wide receiver, but in a good matchup, I definitely like this guy quite a bit. Not the most highly available option, but with his production as of late, you definitely have to pick this guy up. Do not leave him on the waiver wire any longer.
Deebo Samuel, 50% available. Now, next week he plays Green Bay, allowing the 9th fewest points to wide receivers. Not a great matchup there. I don't know if you watch this guy play, but man, he is very physical after the catch. He reminds me a lot of Anquin Bolden or Hines Ward, if you ever watch those guys play. Very physical once again. Last 2 weeks, he's looked unstoppable. He's really earned the trust of Jimmy Garoppolo in that offense. In weeks 10 and 11, he had 10 targets one week, had 11 the other week. Both of those weeks ending in 8 catches. Both those games. In one game, he had 112 yards. The other one, 134 yards. This guy has been on fire. He looks great out there. You need to pick him up. He's the team's number 2 wide receiver behind Emmanuel Sanders. Now, the reason why his numbers that went up, and the reason why I'm still calling him the number 2 behind Sanders. Sanders missed some times. He had a rib injury, but he's still the number 1 guy there. Obviously, Emmanuel Sanders is the number 1, the veteran on that team. But I tell you what, Samuel is a guy that you got to own, especially if you're in a dynasty league. This is a guy that's going to finish this year probably strong, and you can stash and keep him next year. Pick up Deebo Samuel. Looks great in that offense.
All right, so you're looking for a wide receiver with high upside. Maybe you're not necessarily going to start him every week, but maybe perhaps this coming week you're in a tough matchup and you just need a player who could go big or go home. That'd be Darius Slayton at 75% available. It's hard to find a guy with as much upside as him, considering his high availability. He's had some huge games, especially considering last game versus the Jets, his 14 targets, 10 catches, 121 yards, and 2 touchdowns equated to 36.1 fantasy points. That's not the only time he's had a good game. Heading back, we look at his game versus Tampa Bay, 3 catches, 82 yards. Not great, but not horrible. In PPR, that is 11.2 fantasy points. Not phenomenal. He did have 62 yards and a touchdown versus the Vikings in a PPR league, or at least in my league, that was 16 fantasy points. Just 2 weeks ago versus the Lions, he had 19 fantasy points. That was with 2 touchdowns. What we really see with this guy is he's not much of a PPR guy. He's very likely to get you 1, 2, 3, or 4 catches in that sort of very low-end range. But again, he's got 5 touchdowns in the last 3 games. In the last 3 weeks, he has multiple. He has two touchdown games. He's been very effective in finding the end zone. As long as Sterling Shepard is out, he's got the upside to be at least a consideration. This week he plays the Bears, give him the 5th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers, so he certainly holds lower value. I won't address too much of that right now. This isn't a start-sit video, but definitely pick him up, put him on your roster. And, when they come into some better matchups in the fantasy playoffs, round out your wide receiver 3 in a standard league, he can absolutely do that. It's hard for me to not talk about a guy with this much upside, so we had to put him in the video. Darius Slayton has burned some people. He's had some very bad weeks. Heck, just the other week versus Dallas, he had just 1 catch for 6 yards. That's pretty bad. So don't get me wrong, there's some risk involved, but pick him up. You don't have to start him every week. Pick him up. Again, 75% available.
What about Baker Mayfield, 46% available? Okay, I know Baker Mayfield has disappointed a lot of owners. He had an excellent rookie season, came out. He was high. I think he was top 10 on a lot of people's draft boards, and he has been bad. And I think a lot of people are gun shy about using him right now. But I think he's turned a corner, and I think he's back on track. Now, last 3 games, he's averaging just under 19 fantasy points per game, really solid there. During those 3 games, he's had 5 touchdown passes, 0 interceptions, and he added a rushing touchdown. He's got a great matchup next week versus Miami, allowing the 9th most points to quarterbacks. Today, Josh Allen versus Miami looked like Peyton Manning looked great there. I think the addition of Kareem Hunt in that offense is a major boost for him. It helps quite a bit there. So I know Baker Mayfield struggled. I know a lot of you got burned by this guy, but I think for a stream next week, he's a guy that you can play and you can trust for 1 week.
All right, now we got to talk about Derek Carr at 32% available. If you're looking for a quarterback this week, consider Derek Carr. He plays the Jets, giving up the 12th most fantasy points to wide receivers, and he's actually been pretty productive. Now, heading into Week 11, his 9 yards per carry over the previous 4 games was second best in the NFL. He followed that up last game with 10.2 yards per attempt. And so he has been top of the NFL in efficiency per attempt. He's been very consistent. Now, It's interesting for a guy who has such a high efficiency rating per attempt, getting tons of yards per attempt. Why doesn't he have more touchdowns? He's not insanely high in the touchdown marker. That's because they've started to figure out their defense. They're well coached and they run the ball well with Josh Jacobs. But he is a very safe quarterback. And at this point in the season, that's not an insult. I think at the beginning of the year, if I'm talking about drafting a guy before the season started, safe can come across as an insult. At this point in the season, it's not. His last 5 games, he scored 17.7, 23.4, 19.6, 13.1, and 19.8 fantasy points. That is absolute consistency. And if you're heading into a matchup this week where you think, hey, I already look like I'm going to win this game, but I want a good quarterback. I don't want to feel uncomfortable with the quarterback that I'm putting in my lineup. Derek Carr is absolutely the guy to come in. And again, good matchup versus the Jets. So I absolutely like that. Very good situation. Consider him. Again, not the most upside, but safe floor that could very well round out your lineup heading into Week 12.
James Washington, 92% available versus Cincinnati, allowing the 11th most points to wide receivers. So here's what we need to do. I'm going to assume right now at this point that Juju Smith-Schuster and Deontay Johnson are going to clear concussion protocol. They left Week 11 with concussions. When you see if they clear, obviously their potential absence is going to increase James' value. So we're going to have to monitor that as the week goes on. Now, if you look at Washington, he came out of college and he had really last year and this year in the preseason, he looked really good. In fact, going into this year, he really looked poised with Antonio Brown being gone to become the number 2 guy there. I think there's a few things that hurt him this year. One, Ben Roethlisberger going down, obviously, and Deontay Johnson getting some of those targets. But if you look at what's happening recently, there's been a slight increase in his role, his targets, and production. In fact, he has best game as a pro in Week 10 where he had 6 catches, 90 yards, and a touchdown. Now, earlier, Johnson was clearly the number 2 wide receiver there. But he's ceded some of those targets and some of his role to Washington, who I think is going to continue to have an increased role and could have some weekly play value based on the availability of Juju Smith-Schuster and Deontay Johnson. So watch that. But I do like James Washington. He's a guy that's got upside. I like him more in dynasty leagues than I do redraft leagues.
All right, now we can talk about Derrius Guice. At 53% available, he's a pickup you need to consider. Now, when we look at last week, here's what we see from this last game. He comes back from injury, and Adrian Peterson gets the start, and he actually out-carried Derrius Guice 9-7. But Derrius Guice was more productive. His 3.4 yards per carry beats Adrian Peterson's 2.8. Plus, he added in a 45-yard touchdown catch, making that a pretty solid game returning from the IR. Definitely something to consider. His performance was great. Now, he did have a big 45-yard touchdown catch. I do want to preface that, kind of slow the hype down a little bit and say that he has just 5 catches in 3 games. He's not going to be a PPR stud, at least this season. But if you're looking for a running back at this point, it's hard to imagine there's a guy with as much possibility as him. That team isn't great. There's a lot to be desired, especially at the quarterback position from Dwayne Haskins, but it is a good matchup this week. He does play the Detroit Lions, give him the 2nd most fantasy points to running backs. He's a guy who, for me, his biggest strong suit would be as a stash in keeper/dynasty leagues to see maybe if you don't like your roster or you keep a lot of players in your league, put him on your roster, put him on your bench, and see what he does. I think this next game versus Detroit is really going to be a strong telling point. And then, of course, this offseason, we'll see what happens with the quarterback, the offensive line, the whole team. But he's a guy who could have huge value next year. Absolutely worth a dynasty stash. And on that matter, you guys definitely got to check out our dynasty keepers or dynasty trade targets, video that we're going to be coming out with this week. But I believe I already mentioned that. We'll move on now and talk about our next player.
Golden Tate, only 20% available. I know I'm going to get some heat from some of you guys out there that early in the year I say doesn't have a lot of value because I thought, Sterling Shepard's ahead of him. You look at Evan Ingram ahead of him. And then, of course, Saquon Barkley. Well, one, Shepard has been struggling all year with concussions. He is out. Evan Ingram has missed some time. And so he's become your team's number 1 wide receiver. Now, next week, he has a tougher matchup versus the Bears, only allowing the 5th fewest points to wide receivers. Not a great matchup. Now, Sterling Shepard's in concussion protocol, and there's been a lot of talk he's going to go on the IR. It's going to end his year. It's the 3rd time this year he's been on concussion protocol, and that leaves Tate as the number 1 wide receiver there. Now, he was suspended, but his first game back after suspension, he was kind of quiet there. But since then, the next 5 games, he's averaged 8.8 targets per game, 6 catches, and 80.8 receiving yards per game, plus he's added 3 touchdowns, so he's looked really good there. That was not highly available, but if you're in one of the 5 leagues that he's available out there, I think you need to grab this guy. Once again, for a 5th of you, he is available. Golden Tate, pick him up.
All right, at 20% available, if you're looking for a wide receiver, take a look at Tyrell Williams. Now, we just talked about Derek Carr, and this is another player from that Raiders offense that you should consider. The Jets, not only give a lot of fantasy points to quarterbacks, they give up the second most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. And this is a guy who we know can be productive. He had 5 straight weeks to start the season where he scored. That's 5 touchdowns in 5 weeks. He looked very good. Now, since then, over the last 3 weeks, he has struggled, and he hasn't scored in any of those games. But you do have to also notice that's 5 touchdowns in 8 games when you consider bye week and injury. And you take in the fact that this is the easiest matchup he has had all season long. This could very well be a game for him to get back to what he was doing. Now, again, I don't think that he has a super high ceiling. I don't think he's a guy who's going to go for 150 to 200 yards, but a touchdown is a very doable, and I like his quarterback-coach duo. I love what he's working with there. I feel like this is a safe wide receiver 3 plug-in this week.
So here's a guy that he scares me, but some of you, you're desperate, and you're going to need to take a look at this guy, and that's Nelson Agholor, 87% available. Versus Seattle, allowing the 11th most points to wide receivers. Got a good matchup next week. Now, Deshaun Jackson's on the IR. He's done for the year. Alshon Jeffrey missed a game Sunday with an ankle injury, and he's generally struggled this year if you look at Jeffrey. Just not the same wide receiver he was in Chicago when people thought this guy could become a potential perennial All-Pro, possibly Hall of Famer, a perennial guy that's going to get you 1,000 yards every year. Just hasn't been that wide receiver since he left Chicago there. Now, if you go back to weeks 2 and 3 for Nelson Agholor, when some other wide receivers were injured, he had some huge numbers. In fact, he had back-to-back weeks, right over 25 fantasy points per game in PPR leagues. He totaled during those 2 weeks 16 catches, 157 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Now, he's done this many times in his career. If you actually follow Nelson Agholor, there's been many times where he'll get hot, he'll get on fantasy owners' radar to only disappoint you once you grab this guy and feel like you can trust him. Another thing I think makes him a little scary there as far as the presence of Dallas Goedert and Zach Ertz. So I think he's got a limited floor, but they're thin at the wide receiver position. They're facing Seattle, Giants and Miami defense coming up, and so they are very friendly. They do yield points to wide receivers. So Nelson Agholor is a guy that if you're in a deep league and you play 3 wide receivers, let's say in a 16-team league, he could have value for you out there.
All right, now, sort of a last call on the Kenyan Drake train. He's only 17% available, that's why I say that. But if you haven't picked him up, you should definitely still consider it. Unless you're in a very small league, like 6 or 8 teams, he should be on a lineup in every league. Of course, he comes out with that phenomenal game versus a solid 49ers defense with 110 rushing yards, 52 receiving yards. He has not been quite as productive in the 2 games since, but last game he had 67 rushing yards, 4.2 yards per carry, and he had 6 catches on 7 targets. That did just equate to 13 yards. That's 2.2 yards per catch. I didn't watch the game, so I didn't see necessarily the game trends to explain why that happened, but you'd of course like to see him get more yards per catch. The week before he had 7 targets, 6 catches, and 6 yards. So that is definitely a weird situation that we have to look at, but he's been very phenomenal. David Johnson is just... That guy is just disappearing, and Chase Edmonds has been out with that hamstring injury. Kenyan Drake, pick him up. Take a look at him. At least store him on your roster. He does have a tough schedule coming up, though. He plays the Rams, the Steelers, the Seahawks, the Browns, and the Rams.
Cameron Brate. Okay, so a little risky at this point. He's 98% available out there. I do think he's going to have a role. I like O.J. Howard. At least I did go into this year. Burnt me. Drafted him in a couple leagues. Hasn't worked out well, and I had to drop him back in like week 3 or 4. Looked like O.J. Howard's going to get that role back. They're talking about trying to use him more, get him more involved in the offense. But today, he had a terrible play that led to a terrible pick that was not Jameis Winston's fault. And after that, he got benched. They benched O.J. Howard. That led to Brate's huge day. Today he goes out. Brate has 10 catches for 73 yards. Now, we're going to have to watch and see if that benching carries over into week 12. But I would say at least it's going to decrease the value of how much Howard's going to see the field there. It's definitely going to reduce his role anyways. Now, if you look at Brate, this is a guy that's been productive. He's got solid hands. He's a guy that you can trust. He's not flashy. He's not great, but he's a solid tight end. Between 2016 and 2018, he had 20 receiving touchdowns. So he's a veteran tight end that you can trust. And I assume at this point that Howard's going to see a reduced role. I think the coach is frustrated, fed up with his play. You already saw that early in the year, and then today goes out, has a terrible play, gets benched. The guy that's going to benefit from that, of course, is Cameron Brate.
At 27% available, you got to take a look at Jamaal Williams. Now, play San Francisco this week, give him the 3rd fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. I don't think he's a huge play this week. And I'm going to say it now before I get into too much of my research. I think he's a great handcuff for Aaron Jones. That's about it. He is a desperation play if you are very desperate, but you do have to get to quite a certain place to be at that point where you're going to play this guy. He did have 13 carries this week, which actually was the exact same amount of carries that Aaron Jones had. Weird situation. We've talked about this every week on this channel, it feels like. The Packers love to give Jamaal Williams the ball. He's simply not as efficient as Aaron Jones, and they just keep feeding him the ball. That being said, 13 carries is abnormally high for him. He's averaging just 4.6 carries per game over the last 6 games, so that's not a trend we're going to see continue. That's going to come back down to that 4 to 5 range. Now, the other thing to note is that they did each have 13 carries apiece, but Aaron Jones had 3 touchdowns, and that's because he was getting the red zone carries. If you've been paying attention to football this season, red zone carries make a big difference, and they are a key indicator of who the better running back is and who the team trusts, and again, a big indicator of future success. We've seen this in many different situations where you see teams splitting carries amongst their running backs, but the guy that they end up trusting, he gets the red zone carries. I remember it was just a while ago where James White had a pretty good day, but 3 red zone carries went to other backs, and people were saying, James White will be fine, he's going to bounce back. He was so close to touchdowns. The phrase that I always hear is, but he could have easily scored those touchdowns, but he didn't. Why didn't he score those touchdowns? Because another running back was in there. Because when it comes into the goal line, when they need to capitalize on their recent success and get points, they're going to put the guy they trust in there. And that guy has been Aaron Jones, who seriously should be in the MVP race right now. He's a guy that I would put on there as a top 10 consideration, probably maybe even top 5. But Aaron Jones is great. I don't think Jamaal Williams is going to take over that role. I really don't think that. But he is definitely a handcuff to Aaron Jones. And if you are desperate, he can be played in deeper leagues such as 14 to 16 teams. That's my wrap up for him, though. I don't got too much else to add. If you have any questions, you can leave a comment, and I will make sure to give you some more information. I don't want to bog this video down.
Another tight end out there that you should consider is Ryan Griffin, 97% available. In 4 of the last 6 games, he's been very good. So in 4 of the last 6 games, he's been a guy that you could trust play. He got you good numbers. But he's very high risk, high reward. The other 2 games that were sandwiched between those other games were horrible. In fact, the other 2 games, he totaled 2 catches for -1 yard. So you're going to have to roll the dice with this guy a little bit if you're desperate for a tight end. Now, he does play Oakland this week, and they allow the 5th most points to tight ends. Tate goes out, he has a huge game, 5 catches, 109 yards, and a touchdown. I mentioned it earlier, I'm going to say it again. I would love to give you a guy that's a lock, that's great, that you can trust, that you don't have to worry, but there's no Travis Kelce's out there. There's a reason why we tell you, if you have to start a tight end, you might want to grab him early in the draft, because later on, it's hard after the top, maybe 6 or 7 tight ends, to have a guy that you can weekly trust. But if you have to roll the dice, this guy does have upside. His role is increasing. Sam Darnold's playing a little bit better. So definitely consider looking at him for next week.
Now we got Randal Cobb. He's an interesting situation. There are a lot of wide receivers there. Amari Cooper is good. Michael Gallup is good. They've got not a phenomenal, but Jason Witten's a fair tight end to throw to, and of course Ezekiel Elliott in the ground game. But he has back-to-back receiving games of plus 100 yards and a touchdown. For a wide receiver who's 86% available, it's really hard to get that sort of production. And he's had increased targets over the last 3 games. That's not necessarily a fluke. Dak Prescott over the last 3 games has been great. Against the Giants, he threw the ball 35 times for 257 yards and 3 touchdowns. Then he played the Vikings and threw the ball 46 times for 3 yards shy of 400 yards. He had 397 yards and 3 touchdowns. Then he plays the Lions, and he throws for 444 yards and 3 touchdowns. He's got 9 touchdowns in the last 3 games. He looks great. In good matchups, when Dak Prescott's going to be throwing the ball a lot, you definitely have to consider playing Randal Cobb as a wide receiver 3. In matchups where they're maybe looking at a blowout, or against a team with a good pass defense, probably wouldn't play him, but he is worth a roster spot when we consider injuries and bye weeks. So bye weeks will soon be over, thank the Lord. But let's move on to our next guy now. Hey guys, I just wanted to stop you one more time real quick, just for like 30 seconds before the video ends, and give out a huge thank you to our Patreon subscribers. We love the support, the positive comments, any comments, likes, subscriptions, all that. You guys are awesome. But the financial support that we get from a few people on Patreon, that means a lot to us. I think that makes a really big difference and helps us to get new equipment, really support what we're doing here in a little bit larger way. I'm not here to try to convince anybody else to subscribe to us on Patreon, just to stop and say thank you. It really does mean a lot to me and Rob. It goes a long way to help us continuing to produce this content and motivating us to produce better content and more content in the future. Getting better is something that we're really looking at doing, and we want to promise to you guys that we're going to continue to give back as you guys have given so much to us. I already said it once, but I'll say it again. You guys have a great day, and God bless.